It was almost 10 o'clock when Jake checked his watch for the last time. He smiled at himself in the mirror as he put on his jacket. It was getting dark outside, and the cold evening air filled the streets with the noise of passing cars. Today was an important night. His friend Ryan, whom they met in college, finally got the long-awaited promotion. Jake knew that this evening would be a landmark, and he couldn't miss the opportunity to be happy for an old friend. "I'll be a little later," Ryan told him on the phone this morning. "Emma will be there earlier, help her with the preparations, and I'll arrange the final part of the surprise." Emma, his wife, always loved to arrange surprises, bring bright moments into their lives, which were then discussed by all friends and acquaintances. Jake laughed that she lives to organize such events, in which she puts all her strength and passion. He didn't say anything, but when she asked him to come back later to make a spectacular appearance, he found it a little strange. But he didn't think much of it. He liked the way she turned ordinary events into real shows. When he arrived at the house, everything was already in full swing. Light from the windows streamed onto the street where the guests' cars were parked. With loud laughter and conversations, music penetrated through the open windows, creating an atmosphere of fun. He got out of the car and took a step towards the front door, but suddenly something made him slow down his steps. She wasn't there. Somewhere in the crowd of people he expected to see her, his wife. Strange. Jake tried to look for her, but no one paid much attention to him. Several familiar faces appeared. He exchanged a few words with colleagues, but something was wrong in the air. One of the guests, a man in his 30s, with sad eyes and a kind of ordinary expression on his face, approached Jake. He didn't know him too well. He was a friend of Ryan's, whom Jake had talked to several times at parties. The man looked out of place. And it seems that there was something in his gaze that was too wary, and perhaps guilty. "Emma is upstairs. Would you like to come in?" he said softly, nodding slightly towards the stairs. The slight anxiety that was starting to creep up my back turned into a real chill. Why was this guy, whom he barely kept in touch with, suddenly so careful? Why does he have such a strange expression on his face? Jake forced himself to smile and nod. She probably finds time for things. "I'll go after her," he replied, barely hiding his growing concern. With each step up the stairs, his senses became more and more hazy. At first, he wanted to believe that everything was explained by the usual haste, that Emma was just solving some issues. But when he found himself on the top floor in the corridor, it was as if he felt the air become denser. He braked sharply when he saw the door of one of the rooms ajar, behind which he could clearly hear laughter and someone whispering. And so, he took a step and opened the door. She was there when Jake saw her. Everything turned upside down. Emma was sitting on the bed in the company of a man Jake knew only casually, whom he had known for at least 5 minutes. They stood side by side, not knowing what to do with the sudden tension in the air, as if they had just performed something forbidden. Emma pulled away from him with difficulty, quickly averting her gaze and trying to get up. The man, who was clearly feeling the same awkwardness as her, got out of bed with a jerky movement and immediately went to the window. Emma didn't even have time to hide her emotions. Her eyes were wide open, her face turned pale, and she pressed her lips together as if trying to suppress what she wanted to say. But not a word came out of her mouth. Jake felt his stomach curl into a tight ball. It was like a blow. He understood perfectly well what was going on here. He didn't scream. He just stood there, not knowing how to react to what he had just seen. His eyes couldn't tear themselves away from her, from what she had done. Emma didn't move, couldn't even look in his direction. The man at the window stood like a statue, his shoulders slightly lowered. He also did not know what to do. There were no excuses, silence. Jake knew that there were no words that could fix what had happened. He didn't say a word, didn't ask questions, didn't shout, didn't try to understand. He just turned around and walked out. Jake walked through the house, feeling the ground become alien under his feet. All that was in his mind was her gaze. Her silence. He no longer heard the sounds of music around him as he walked towards the exit. Something inside him broke. He stepped out into the dark night, and the cold instantly chilled to the bone. The morning came hard. Jake was sitting in the kitchen, trying to swallow a piece of dry toast. Emma didn't come to the bedroom this morning. He could hear her moving in the next room, but he couldn't bring himself to approach her. When Emma entered the kitchen, he didn't even turn his head. She looked the same as yesterday, and at the same time completely different. His gaze swept over her face, but did not linger. He knew she was in pain, but he couldn't feel it. All he felt was emptiness. Emma stood in the doorway, not knowing where to start. She was obviously expecting something, but she couldn't figure out how to find the words that would justify her even a little. She went to the table, reached for a cup of coffee, but froze when she noticed how Jake's lips tightened. "Jake, please talk to me." Her voice was low, trembling, but there was some vague determination inside. She wasn't looking for excuses. She wasn't trying to justify herself. "I was just looking for a chance." Jake didn't say anything. He got up from his seat and stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the emptiness of the courtyard, where traces of the night rain were still visible. He continued to be silent, but his silence was scarier than any speech. Emma came closer and stood next to him, but even in her touch there was something cold, inappropriate. She tried to look into his eyes, but he avoided her gaze. I know you won't forgive me, Jake. I know I ruined everything, but I'm sorry. All I can say is that I was stupid. I didn't think, I didn't feel." Her voice weakened with every word. Jake clenched his fists. My fingers began to ache from the strain. He turned around, but he wasn't looking at her. "Didn't you think? Seriously? You didn't think when?" His voice broke and he fell silent. He couldn't speak without feeling the pain tearing at him from the inside out. He saw her faces, that very night in the guest room, her expression, her face when she saw him. Everything was coming back with renewed vigor. Emma tried to take a step forward, but he raised his hand again, preventing her from approaching. She felt her own heart begin to beat faster. She had to do something, say something to get him back. But her words didn't move him. "I can't." Jake said it slowly, as if speaking to himself. "I can't believe you anymore, Emma." She gripped the edge of the table, trying to hold herself back. She felt her world crumbling. She couldn't believe that everything they had built over so many years could collapse overnight. And what would she have to do to get it all back? She didn't know. "You don't even want to hear why this happened?" Her words echoed in the silence. She noticed how his face paled for a moment. But he turned away again. "What can I hear, Emma? Your excuses." Jake's voice was as hard as a knife blade. His words penetrated deeply, and he himself did not know how he was able to pronounce them. "You're not even apologizing for what I saw. You just came here, and now you want me to listen to you." There were tears in her eyes, but she didn't want to cry. She didn't want to look weak. But her face twisted in pain. "I do not know what happened. I lost myself. I couldn't afford it. I thought that he was just a moment. I didn't mean to hurt you. You know I love you. You've always been everything to me." Her voice rose, and she took a step toward him, but he backed away again. "Don't talk to me about love. Your love is not what I imagined it to be. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this." Jake sighed and went to the door. "You made the choice so easily. It doesn't matter what you say. You chose him." Emma stood there, not knowing what to do. She felt a cold sweat run down her back, as something dark and scary began to fill the room. She remembered all the times she had cheated on him. Every excuse she made sounded like an empty excuse, every look like a lie. "I can't live like this, Jake. I can't live knowing that I've lost you. Please." Her voice was now filled with despair. He looked at her, and there was nothing but emptiness in his eyes. He didn't answer. He just turned around and walked out. Emma remained standing in the center of the room, clasping her hands, feeling her own world crumble. Jake didn't know exactly when he made the decision. Probably yesterday. All he knew was that he couldn't look at her anymore. I couldn't listen to her. An hour later, Emma was standing on the threshold. She had a suitcase in her hands. Her movements were heavy, as if she were carrying the entire weight of her world. She didn't look him in the eye, but Jake could see her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't. The pause dragged on. He expected these words, these emotions, but all she did was just whisper, I'm leaving, Jake." Her voice was shaking, but she was holding back tears. She took a step back, leaving his life forever. "You don't even want to listen to me, Jake. I understand that." Her voice became even quieter, but there was no despair in it, only emptiness, the emptiness from which she came. "You can't forgive me, I know." His heart contracted, and he felt the cold alienation crashing down on him again. But he didn't move, didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, looking at her like she was a stranger, like someone who no longer had a place in his life. "You're right," he said. and his words sounded hollow, like an echo in a dark room. Emma didn't answer. She took a step back, her suitcase sliding softly across the floor as she turned, ready to leave. Her movements seemed to be mechanical, devoid of any life. Jake watched her leave his house. He saw her get into the car and drive away. But there was no relief, no sense of victory. There was only emptiness. He returned to the house and, as if in slow motion, felt the wall between him and everything that had once been his life getting thicker. The man who once believed in love was now sitting alone, without anything. He had lost her, and he didn't know what to do next. The moment when he made his decision had already been past. Now there was only one thing left to do: live with it. How do you live with something that no longer exists? It's been 3 months since Emma left. 3 months later, Jake seemed to have learned to breathe again. He was the same person, but somehow different at the same time. Time has become strange, like a fog that does not dissipate, but simply absorbs everything around. He still woke up in the middle of the night, feeling her presence. The smell of her perfume, her footsteps on the stairs, her voice, which seemed to always be there, even when he was not. It remained. It was forever. He went to work like a zombie, like a man who was just doing his job so as not to be completely lost. It seemed to him that the whole city was looking at him, that every face on the street reflected something personal, something familiar. He felt his life empty. And it was a strange feeling. He was used to being alone, but not to this. He knew that he had loved her once, knew that he had once wanted to be with her, but now it was like an alien memory. Emma didn't call. Jake didn't want her to call. And yet, every morning when he checked his phone, he felt a strange hope. Maybe she'll write? Would she try to take it all back again? But there were no messages. He was learning to live anew, step by step. At first, he started running in the morning. It wasn't to become a better version of himself. He didn't believe in such things. He just wanted to feel that his body could do something, that it was still able to move, and not be motionless like his heart. One day after jogging, when his body seemed unable to move any further, he noticed a woman on a park bench. She was sitting there with a book in her hands, and his gaze accidentally crossed hers. She smiled, a slight, almost imperceptible smile, but her eyes were clear. She didn't ask his name, she just sat and read. Jake continued on his way, but her image remained in his mind. There was something about her presence that was so light. He couldn't figure out why, but the feeling gave him the strength to move on. The next morning, Jake called the real estate agent. Selling a house, he said without even thinking. He didn't know what would happen to him, but he knew that this house couldn't be his anymore. He knew he needed to get out of it all before he completely drowned in his pain. One evening, when he was sitting on the balcony of his new apartment, with a cup of coffee in his hands, he saw the same woman in the park again. She was passing by, and this time her gaze was not accidental. She stopped and came over. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but confident. "Did you run today?" He nodded, smiling a little. He didn't know what to say. But when she sat down next to him and started talking about how she liked this park, how her life had also changed over the past year, he felt something unusual. Not love, not desire, just something fresh, something that reminded him of the future. They talked for a long time. Jake felt the air around him fill with lightness. And perhaps it was in this conversation that he felt that his life was beginning to make sense again. Not because of her, not because of other people, but because of himself. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he was no longer a prisoner of his past. But there was a shadow inside him. A shadow that no one and nothing could pull out. A shadow of betrayal, a shadow of pain. But he already knew that going further was his choice. And he was ready to go.